I was 17 years old, standing in a hallway lined with portraits of ancestors who did not look like me, and not one member of my family had ever told me I belonged among them. My name is Stacy Whitmore, and I was the only black child in one of the wealthiest royal bloodlines in the country, raised behind the gates of Ashcombe Manor by a family that never once let me forget I was different. If this story moves you, please like, comment, and subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting here. The Whitmore family had ruled over Ashcombe for 6 generations, our name attached to sprawling estates, entire villages, and a fortune so vast that most of the staff who worked within the manor's walls had never seen the full extent of it themselves. At the head of the family sat my grandfather, David Whitmore, the aging patriarch, heir to it all, and the one person in that enormous house who ever looked at me with something resembling unconditional love. Everyone else looked at me differently. My mother, Ada, carried herself through every social event with the practiced elegance expected of her station. But whenever I stood beside her in public, something in her expression would tighten. A barely concealed discomfort I learned to recognize before I was even old enough to understand what it meant. She never said the words directly. She didn't have to. The way she angled her body slightly away from me at charity galas, the way she introduced my sister first and me almost as an afterthought, said everything that needed saying. My father, John, was worse in his own quiet way. He reserved his warmth entirely for my sister Amelia, 2 years older than me. Golden-haired and pale-skinned, in the exact way that fit seamlessly into the family portraits lining our grand staircase. He taught her to ride horses personally. He took her on business trips, introduced her to investors, spoke of her future running the family's affairs with obvious pride. Toward me, he offered instructions instead of affection. Fetch this, clear that. Stand somewhere else when guests arrive. He treated his own daughter less like a Whitmore and more like staff who happened to share his last name. Amelia had absorbed our parents' treatment of me and made it entirely her own. She refused to let me touch her belongings, refused to sit beside me at family dinners when she could avoid it, and never once in 17 years referred to me as her sister in front of anyone outside the family. To her, and increasingly to the household staff who took their cues from the family they served, I existed on the edges of a life I was supposedly born into. I was rarely permitted to leave the manor grounds, while Amelia attended galas, traveled abroad, and built a life full of movement and color. I remained largely confined behind Ashcombe's iron gates, my days measured out in empty hallways and rooms I wasn't allowed to fully claim as mine. The only person who ever fought for me was my grandfather. David Whitmore had, in many ways, raised me himself. From the moment he witnessed how his son and daughter-in-law treated me, something in him had hardened with a quiet, unshakable resolve. He couldn't undo the family's prejudice entirely, not without tearing the household apart in ways that might have hurt me even further, but he could make certain I never doubted, at least within his presence, that I was loved completely and without condition. He read to me as a child. He sat with me during holidays when my parents made excuses to be elsewhere. And when he discovered, almost by accident, that I possessed a genuine gift for drawing, he made a decision he kept carefully hidden from the rest of the family. Every Monday and Thursday afternoon, while my parents were occupied with the estate's endless social obligations, he arranged for a private tutor to travel from the city to the manor, a soft-spoken art instructor named Malcolm Reyes, who taught me painting, sketching, and the quiet discipline of watching light move across a canvas. My grandfather paid for it entirely from his own private accounts, kept it off every household ledger, and swore Malcolm to complete discretion. It was during those lessons that I met Dave. Malcolm's 16-year-old son often accompanied his father to the manor, waiting quietly in the hallway outside the makeshift studio my grandfather had arranged in a disused sitting room. At first, Dave and I exchanged nothing more than polite nods. But children left alone in large, quiet houses eventually find their way to each other. And within a few months, those brief nods became conversations, and those conversations became something neither of us had a name for yet. Dave was the first person outside my grandfather who ever made me feel like an ordinary girl instead of an unwanted anomaly in my own family's history. He asked about my drawings with genuine curiosity. He noticed when something was wrong before I said a word. He never once made me feel like my presence needed to be explained or excused. Over 4 years, twice weekly, in stolen hours between painting lessons, something quiet and steady grew between us, hidden as carefully as the lessons themselves. By the time I turned 21, Dave and I were deeply in love, though not a single member of my family had any idea. I think my grandfather suspected. He had watched me closely enough over the years to notice the particular light in my eyes on lesson days, and though he never asked directly, he made certain those lessons continued without interruption, without explanation, and without his son's knowledge. He had tried, more than once, to convince my father to treat me with the basic decency any father owed his child. Each time, my father had waved the conversation away with the same practiced indifference he showed me directly. My grandfather had accepted, painfully, that he could not force his son to love his own daughter. But he could make certain that when his time came, love would not be the only inheritance I walked away with. The night everything changed arrived without warning, the way most devastating nights do. A violent storm swept across the estate, rain hammering the ancient windows of Ashcombe Manor with a force that rattled the frames. Inside, panic of a different kind was unfolding. My grandfather, 83 years old, had collapsed in his study earlier that evening, and by the time the family physician arrived, it was clear the patriarch was living out his final hours. Word spread through the manor with terrible speed. Relatives who hadn't visited in years suddenly appeared at the gates, soaked from the storm, faces arranged into expressions of practiced grief. Household staff gathered in hushed clusters along the hallways. Amelia wept openly in my mother's arms. My father paced outside the bedroom door, his composure cracking for perhaps the first time I had ever witnessed. I stood at the back of the crowded room, exactly where I had always been positioned within this family, present but peripheral, close enough to grieve but never quite close enough to matter. I watched my grandfather's chest rise and fall with increasing effort, his breathing growing shallow beneath the oxygen mask the physician had fitted moments earlier. My grandfather had never formally named his heir. In a family built entirely around inheritance and bloodline, the single omission had created years of quiet, simmering tension. Cousins and distant relatives circling for decades. Certain the title and fortune would eventually fall to my father, the eldest son, and by extension to Amelia, the golden granddaughter everyone assumed was destined for the role. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence as his eyes fluttered open one final time. His gaze moved slowly across the crowded room, past my father, past my mother, past Amelia's tear-streaked face, until it settled, finally and unmistakably, on me. "Stacy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm outside. Every head in the room turned toward me at once. "My granddaughter. My heir." The words landed like a physical blow across the room. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father went completely still, his face draining of color. Amelia's sobbing stopped entirely, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. My grandfather's lawyer, present in the room as he had been for months in anticipation of exactly this moment, stepped forward and confirmed in a steady voice that cut through the shocked murmurs rippling across the room that David Whitmore's final wishes regarding his estate had already been formally documented weeks earlier. Witnessed and notarized, entirely legal and entirely irreversible. My grandfather's hand found mine between labored breaths. His eyes, cloudy now but still achingly familiar, held mine with a tenderness that had never once wavered in 17 years. "You were always mine," he whispered. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Moments later, my grandfather closed his eyes for the final time. The grief in that room was immediate and genuine in places, but it was almost instantly overtaken by something far uglier. I watched the shock ripple across my family's faces and understood, with painful clarity, that their disbelief had far less to do with losing him than with the identity of the person he had chosen to leave everything to. Relatives who had barely acknowledged my existence for 2 decades suddenly stared at me with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and open hostility. I heard the whispers even as they tried to keep them hushed. "Not truly a Whitmore, doesn't even look like the rest of the family. Surely there's been some mistake." There had been no mistake. In the weeks that followed the funeral, the lawyers confirmed everything in full, methodical detail. My grandfather had begun restructuring his estate nearly 2 years earlier, quietly transferring authority, documenting his intentions, and ensuring that no legal challenge could ever unravel what he'd built for me. The manor, the surrounding villages, the family's vast financial holdings, the ancestral title itself. All of it now belonged entirely to a 21-year-old woman my family had spent her entire life trying to make invisible. I was granted full security detail, complete legal authority, and formal recognition as head of the Whitmore family within the month. The villages and cities that had operated for generations under Whitmore governance now answered ultimately to me. My parents' fury was immediate and, for the first time in my life, entirely powerless. My father attempted to contest the will through every legal channel available to him, spending considerable sums on lawyers who each, eventually, delivered the same verdict. My grandfather's documentation was airtight, prepared meticulously enough that no court would entertain a challenge. My mother's outrage curdled slowly into something closer to desperate humiliation as she watched the daughter she'd spent 2 decades disregarding assume complete control over everything the family had ever possessed. I did not seek revenge, though few would have blamed me if I had. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even those closest to me. I allowed my parents and sister to remain within the family's holdings, housed comfortably on a smaller estate several miles from the main manor, provided for financially, secure, and unharmed. But I made one boundary unmistakably clear. I wanted nothing further to do with any of them. The apology letters began arriving within months. My mother's, carefully worded and formal at first, gradually became more desperate as seasons passed. My father's arrived less frequently, his pride apparently a harder obstacle than his guilt. Emilia wrote perhaps the most letters of all, long, rambling pages, attempting to explain away 20 years of cruelty as childhood misunderstanding. I read every single one. I answered none of them. 20 years of being made to feel like an intruder within my own family had not simply dissolved the moment a title was placed in my hands. Forgiveness, I had come to understand, was not something owed automatically to people simply because circumstances had shifted in my favor. It was something earned through years of decency that my family had never once offered me when it might have actually mattered. Dave stood beside me through all of it, exactly as he had stood beside me, quietly and steadily, since we were teenagers, hiding stolen conversations in the hallway outside a painting lesson neither set of parents fully understood. Within a year of my grandfather's passing, Dave and I were married in a small ceremony at Ashcombe Manor. Surrounded by staff who had watched me grow up largely unseen, by villagers who had come to know and respect their new head of a family, and by the memory of the one man who had always insisted I belonged exactly where I now stood. We built a life together across the manor's sprawling grounds, eventually raising 3 children within walls that had once made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I filled those same hallways with paintings of my own. Portraits that finally included faces that looked like mine, hung proudly alongside 6 generations of ancestors who had once made me feel entirely invisible. I think of my grandfather often, particularly in the quiet hours I still spend painting. The discipline he secretly gifted me all those years ago having become, eventually, one of the great joys of my adult life. I kept his study exactly as he left it, a private space within the manor that remains entirely mine, filled with the memory of a man who loved me without condition in a family built almost entirely around conditions. I have governed the family's estate for years now, fair and steady in a way my own upbringing rarely offered me. I never sought punishment for my parents or my sister, understanding, perhaps more clearly than they ever fully grasped themselves, that the family's true reckoning had already occurred the moment my grandfather looked past every prejudice they'd built their lives around and chose, with his final breath, the granddaughter who had deserved to be chosen all along.